Is everybody ready?
Perfect.
Okay, so I think we are good to go. All right, I think let us get going, colleagues. Good afternoon, at least from our time. I know that we've got colleagues joining us from all parts of the world. Colleagues, my name is Philani Mthembu. I am at the Institute for Global Dialogue and looking forward to this conversation today, which will really present key findings on a recently released report. I think today is our first open and public dialogue or webinar that we're having for 2023. It's titled New Players and New Ties in the Indian Ocean, a win-win for Mauritius, ? And I think it's quite a timely report because it basically explores the presence of these new actors in the Indian Ocean who are gaining importance, of course. And of course, the ocean we know is gaining importance as a geopolitical hotspot with a number of countries vying to consolidate or establish a presence in the Indian Ocean. Today's particular webinar is focused on Mauritius, an island state on the Western Indian Ocean, and particularly focusing on the engagement with China and with India. And we've noticed that both of these countries are deploying increasing soft power tactics in what could be termed a competition to win the hearts and minds of the Mauritian people. It particularly focuses on issues of trade and investment, and then also on knowledge production and network building, while looking at some of the spillover effects on African countries. And I think, colleagues, this conversation is very important, but not only the conversation, but the research that went into it, because it is important that the African continent overcomes what might be called a sea blindness, where we tend to focus on what is happening on the continent, but to the exclusion of what is an extension of our continent on the various oceans and seas that surround the continent. So I will not keep my remarks long because we've got about an hour and 15 minutes, and the time is going to go by very quickly. So what I will do, colleagues, is just introduce our two main speakers and also introduce our respondent for the day. Our speakers, it is Dr. Ruqaiya Kassenali, who is an associate professor at the University of Mauritius and is a co-author of the report. And then we're also joined by Manisha Dukoni, who is an independent trade and investment expert and also a co-author of this report. We're also joined by my colleague as a respondent, Arina Morrison, who is a senior researcher at the Institute for Global Dialogue. And I look forward to this conversation and also to the input that may be coming from the colleagues who have joined us online. Remember, feel free to send your questions into the chat, so you don't have to wait until everyone has finished speaking. Send your questions in the chat and these will be monitored by our speakers. And with that, colleagues, let me first ask Dr. Ruqaiya Kassenali to just give us her introductory remarks and analysis on the importance of this report, but also its broader implications for the African continent. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Philani and colleagues from IGD, and thank you for all our participants in this webinar. It's such a privilege to be the first for 2023. I think it sets the ball rolling in those types of conversation. And I adhere very much with what Filani has said, that, you know, the African continent should not, overlook its the smaller islands, which form, an inherent part of the continental sort of process in terms of issues, concerns. I just wanted to ask you to share the map that was developed for this particular research project. And once you see the map, it will give you really an understanding of the justification of why such a project is important, in terms of, of a number of questions that we pose, both Manisha, my co-author, and myself. So if you can share it on the screen, that would be great. I'm not seeing it on my side.
I think Karina will help us with that, unless she gives you the ability to share it yourself.
All right. Let me just, okay. Excellent.
There it is. It's coming up.
All right. So it's coming up, and this really was our understanding why such a report and such a research was important. It poses a number of questions around the interest, but also the intentionality behind that. So you can see the waters of the Indian Ocean, and you can see the different islands, which we call the Western Indian Ocean island, Mauritius being one of it. So if you see the choke points, and we've developed a number of key pointers to actually show how this particular sort of region. So if you can click and we start showing how busy it gets, you will start seeing, the naval bases. Arena, you just can click, it's a PowerPoint presentations, or you can go to the final, which will give you an understanding of the. Just if you keep clicking, because it's an animation. Yeah. Right. I wanted to do it step by step, but if you can put it on larger screen, that will help us. So you can see how busy this particular region is, from starting with the choke points to the naval bases, and to the Confucius Institute that China has developed in the Indian Ocean, Western Indian Ocean islands, but also I'm not looking at the African continent. We're looking at the special economic zone, which Madagascar and Mauritius have one each. The Maritime Silk Road in blue, the oil transportation network in orange, the maritime shipping network in brown, and the submarine cable. And you've got 5 of them crisscrossing in this particular area of the Indian Ocean. So you can see, with this particular map and mapping we've done, why this region is gaining traction, interest, has a geopolitical hotbed, but also has, an accelerated and a more amplified sort of presence of certain players. We talked about India and China being new players, but they have had long historical links with Mauritius. I mean, diplomatic, historical, economic links. But what we've seen in this report is that in the recent times, there's been a much more amplified and accelerated presence. So this particular map poses a number of questions about intentionality, why the Indian Ocean is such an important area to have a presence. We in the report talk about and emphasize the soft power dimension, and why, and as Filani said in his opening remarks, winning the hearts and minds of people through soft power. And for us, we've noticed in the research, and it points out that both China and India are doing a pretty good job, because we rest on one of the most recent research that has come out, the indicators from the Afrobarometer round 9, and Afrobarometer round 9 and in round 8 as well has started to record, China's sort of political and economic influence on the African continent. And when we actually look at the case of Mauritius, both China and Africa respectively garner 70 and 76% of positive to somewhat positive influence among Mauritian responders in terms of its political and economic sort of influence. So, the visibility of China and India on the Indian Ocean, on Mauritius, seems to be gaining interest, interaction, and interest among, respondents. But as I mentioned, it's important to sort of look at the relationship that exists for nearly more than 50 years and more than 75 years with India, and that 68%, for example, of the Mauritian population hail from Indian sort of heritage and stock. So obviously, India has always had a very important link with the Mauritian people. Very often we refer to Mauritius as Little India, but China has also made a number of very important inroads. And I think this has essentially been seen, and the report talks about that in terms of the big ticket infrastructures, roads, hospitals, and that's not very different from what we've been seeing on the African countries. So we see roads, we see bridges, we see hospitals, we see airports, we see railway, light railway. So what we also find interesting, and maybe very specific to Mauritius, is what we refer in the report to as the push and pull effect between China and India in terms of trying to occupy space, trying to occupy visibility. For example, it was India who was given the project to build Mauritius light railway, and not China, because if you look at the case in Africa, most of the railway across Africa is built by China. So the question that we also come up with is, for example, whether the presence of India in Mauritius is acting has a balancing act or has a deterrent to some of the more sort of quote unquote corrosive approaches of China. So this is something that we pause and we ask, and obviously there is no clear answer to that. It might be, but be careful as well. We increasingly see that India also is operating in a particular manner to want and have, in terms of its geopolitical and presence in the Indian Ocean. And I think the case of Agalega, in terms of an Indian presence, or which Mauritius has allowed India to have a presence on Agalega, and there's been a lot of opacity or hush-hush about what exactly is happening on Agalega. But I will actually zoom to my section, which I was responsible in this particular report, and I chose to look within that soft power sort of a paradigm at knowledge production and networking, two very important elements that both China and India are really have invested in the last 10 years. I look at the case of the University of Mauritius, where I'm based myself, and I look at the case of the media, the Mauritian media, which are both are being used as important sort of platforms to try and push the soft power, both by India and by China, although China is much more aggressive in terms of knowledge production and support in terms of technology transfer. We look at the role of institutions that have been set up at the university. For example, the Confucius Institute that has its branch on the Redjui campus. We look at, what is its function, its impact, its outreach, what students and academics have to say about it, what type of outreach and what type of engagement they are having. The report looks specifically at technology transfer. The University of Mauritius has a partnership with Huawei in terms of the Huawei Academy. There's been a number of training programs. There's been a number of exchanges and partnership between Huawei and the University of Mauritius in terms of training students, in terms of recruiting students to work for Huawei. And that poses a question in terms of knowledge transfer, the type of knowledge being transferred, the types of technology transfer, and so on and so forth. And sometimes we see and we pose the question whether there is this move, this shift towards what one might call an Easternization of knowledge. I mean, it is interesting to sort of probably dig further. What does this Easternization of knowledge mean? And what does it mean for a Western-based knowledge system, which Mauritius has always, referred to because being sequentially colonized by the French and the British. We've had a very strong tradition of Western tradition, and then we start seeing this presence on the shift towards Easternization. But the question is posed whether it's something that's going to accentuate, or is it just a blip, or is it just because we see a lot of involvement and investment in different areas by both China and India. Then the report looks and focuses on the media in Mauritius. We know that the media has always been an important platform for shaping opinions and shaping knowledge about countries, about ideology, etc. And it has been very interesting to actually look at how both India and China, and more specifically about how China is perceived by the media. And we interviewed a number of media professionals, and it was interesting that we came up with a number of times there was this sort of pro-Western bias by the media, and a number of journalists mentioned that we have to correct this pro-Western bias in the Mauritian media, and that players such as China are important, players such as India are very important. So we need to tell the story. And how do we tell the story without, engaging in what we call rather charged or rather sort of narratives or information flows. So the report talks extensively about, those narratives and how those narratives are built, and how the media in Mauritius, do they have, an understanding of China and India, and asking the more pertinent and critical questions. Some journalists told us that they have been sort of dissuaded or persuaded to actually not run the more critical stories about China and India, because it might hurt feelings, but it also might hurt some of the sponsorship programs or support programs that either China or India gives through some of its commercial projects. So I think this really sort of looks at the intentional, and the question that we really want in this particular conversation, and the report has tried to answer, although it's work in progress. Why now? What is a real intentionality? Mauritius is a small country. Yes, it is a small country, but it has a formidable exclusive economic zone. It has a number of outer islands, and it has, and it sits smack in the middle of the Indian Ocean. And when you look at the map, it gives you an understanding, of the relevance, the importance, and the questions that we have to ask as researchers about what will come next, and how do we actually anticipate those moves, and how are we ready as academics, as colleagues, as researchers to try and take head on some of those challenges that might be posed. Thank you. I think I'll stop there, and then maybe I can come back later.
No, thank you very much, Rukaya, for that. And I think it's quite important you ending on the note of, that despite being, a small country, but, I would argue that Mauritius has, we're speaking about soft power in terms of China and India, but I would argue Mauritius itself has soft power, within the continent, and part of that, as you said, is your economic zone, and sort of how it has looked at itself as a country that does not necessarily have enemies, but that is friends, with everyone. And I think that goes partly to the heart of this question mark of whether Mauritius is able to exert itself and to promote win-win relations with these new actors. But I think I also find interesting the idea of a shift in knowledge consumption, but also in knowledge production, potentially towards the East. And actually, the perceptions you are saying resonates quite a lot with some of the work that some of my colleagues have been leading in terms of perceptions of China in Africa. So I think it's quite interesting in that sense. With that, colleagues, let me give the floor to Manisha Dukoni, who will also go into especially also some of the trade and investment areas, but also just expanding on some of the points that Rukaya has made.
Thank you very much, Philani. Thanks, Rukaya. And I want to start essentially, as you mentioned, Philani, by expanding on one of the thoughts that Rukaya has started laying the ground for. When we started this exercise, so Rukaya and I were like, but it seems odd. Mauritius is very small. I guess a better candidate would likely be Madagascar, with the size, with the resources, etc. We know both of those countries have been looking for resources. The main question that we asked ourselves was why the Indian Ocean, first of all, is becoming important, and also why now, what is happening? And that what is happening, we started looking then at trade and at trade data and at what was happening at a larger level. And what we realized is, and I'm happy this map is still on, is that nowadays what's happening is you have larger and larger vessels, ships, that are going very often from China to whether it is Europe or towards places such as Latin America, and a lot of those towards Brazil, where those large ships cannot cross the Suez Canal anymore. One, the Suez Canal, as you might have seen when there was the big congestion, when one of the ships crossing there met with some issues, and that led to quite a lot of congestion. The Suez Canal is, first of all, very congested. Secondly, it hasn't met with the trend, it hasn't followed the trend. Now they are looking at expanding the size and expanding it to allow larger and larger vessels to be able to cross the Suez Canal. And having said that, this is one of the reasons why many of the large vessels are now crossing into some of those shipping lines that we're seeing. These shipping lines are showing from point to point, but this region is becoming, and has become over the years, one of the most busy shipping lines in the world. So when we're looking at vessels coming from the Strait of Malacca, from China towards Africa, many of them crossing the Horn of Africa, going, as I mentioned, to either Brazil or to the eastern coast of the US, which is now becoming more important in terms of ports, or towards the port of Rotterdam. These lines that we see are actually thicker and thicker because of the amount of traffic that is going in there. Now, first, when we look at the traffic, we realize over the years this traffic has really expanded. And secondly, when we look at the traffic crossing, we find that a lot of this traffic is crossing either near or within Mauritian waters. Because although Mauritius is a small point, Mauritius also owns a lot of islands, including Agalega, including the Chagos archipelago with some disputes going on there, and some other locations such as Saint-Brandon, etc. So the size of the continental shelf on which Mauritius sits, and Mauritius as the Republic of Mauritius and all the islands that are part of Mauritius, and of course Rodrigues as well, makes it that it is a huge expanse of territory through which a lot of those big ships have to go through. And when we're saying big ships, it means a lot of resources that are having to go from one place to the other. And many of those currently are coming from China, but with India becoming more and more an important economic power and going to, or already having surpassed China in terms of population, these securing of the maritime routes becomes more and more important. And I think it's important for us to start from there, because that is what we think is perhaps one of the key points where you have policy and politics meeting the economics of things, so the trade routes and the trade things. And many things kind of what we say in French, découle de là, so follow from that key perception, key factor at that economic level. Now, this is maybe to give it a bigger perspective and to go beyond the sea blindness of us as a small nation surrounded by sea. What we looked into was also that interplay of the different actors. We also assessed the older actors versus the new actors. And in the older actors, we see the European countries, France and British being some of them. The US having been one of those that has kind of been borderline because of the Chagos problem. They haven't really come up frontal in terms of their collaboration, etc. With we have good collaboration, but more in terms of those power interplay that is happening. The other thing that is interesting for us to look at when we're looking at that power interplay, and when we look at this chart, currently this, shall we say, the naval base in Agalega is hush-hush. We don't know what is happening, except that satellite images are showing that there is something happening there. And if we look at the power play within the Indian Ocean, we see that Reunion down, there is the French that are there. Chagos up, you have the British and the American that are there to secure route. But from Chagos to Mauritius or to Reunion, there's a kind of a blind spot in some way there. So, and in some way, that's where we also see some of the power play that is coming in towards supporting in helping that blind spot. Now, maybe I'll just add a couple of things here. There is, in our analysis, of course, as I mentioned, we looked at the different countries, but we then also realized that the two that have been the most active in terms of whether it is investment, whether it is on trade, it really is India and China. In 2017, China started negotiating a new trade agreement with Mauritius. It's called the FTA, the Free Trade Agreement between Mauritius and China. And that trade agreement, when it was signed, I think if there wasn't COVID, it was likely going to be signed in 2020. But COVID hit and they had to delay, so it was signed in it came into force in 2021, which means that it took them, let's say, just about 3 years for this agreement to come into being. At the same time, well, not at the same time, but much before, from 2003 onwards, India had been negotiating a trade agreement, or Mauritius and India had been negotiating a trade agreement called SECPA. And that trade agreement, sometimes it was on the table, sometimes it was not. There were lots of conditionalities to it, and one of the big conditionality was with respect to the double taxation agreement that Mauritius and India had, to review the double taxation agreement, etc. I have had the chance to be part of some of the higher level negotiations that were held in the earlier part of these negotiations. And I have to say that it had always been really tough negotiation. And we always thought this is just never going to happen because of all the conditionalities that were being put in and all the issues that were being raised. In 2021, this agreement was signed after the one that China signed with Mauritius. And you could really see everyone was quite surprised at this timing, like between the Chinese agreement and the Indian agreement. And one of the things that we always feel, we don't know whether it's true or not, but we feel that maybe thanks to the Chinese agreement, we now have the SECPA with India. Now, having said that, when you look at the content of both of those agreements, you see that the agreement with China is really a very open agreement in terms of the what we call the conditions for accessing the Chinese market. It's much easier in terms of the way you calculate products that are coming from Mauritius, how do you source them, etc. But again, China is a huge market, and it's very difficult for a small country to start getting into such a huge market. But it's very open, and it's very open from day one. About more in between 80 to 90% of the Indian of the HS code for China is open to Mauritian products. And we're talking about something between 3,000 to 4,000 goods. Goods meaning tariff lines that can be exported from Mauritius to China And similarly for Mauritius, Mauritius has always had quite an open policy in terms of its trade, and therefore we can have lots of Chinese products coming in at a lower cost. While the agreement with China, with India, has very few products. If we're looking just at quantum, it's a very small amount of product. And when you look also in terms of the content of the agreement are well, the non-trade related content. The agreement with China has lots of what we would call statements of good intention, of goodwill. It says that we would like to do this. While for the Chinese agreement, it says, well, we're going to set up a renminbi clearing house in Mauritius. So it's very clear, it's very targeted, it's very clear onto things that would bring value. Actually, having a renminbi clearing house in Mauritius is things that is likely going to bring about quite a lot of value for the country. Now, keeping all the politics apart and all the issues relating to well, the diplomacy, etc., when you look just at in comparing these two agreements, you do find that Mauritius is likely going to gain more from the agreement with China than from the agreement with India, unless, as has been said, the agreement with India is just the starting point, and there may be other levels that get into it. On the level of investment, we find as well, we do see quite a bit of a shift. A lot of the investment, large investment by the Chinese have happened, and we see kind of a line, a dotted line in some way, until 2015. After 2015, those that were still ongoing continued, but that you don't see any major big new ones. While for India, you see a ramping up of the amount of institutional type of investment that has been put in. Ruka rightly pointed out the metro project, but apart from the metro project, there's, for instance, the big project to put in, well, that has been completed now, to put in the new courthouse. There is a project, I don't know, I think it's completed as well, to bring in new hospitals. There, for the metro, there are extensions, and there's a new extension that is expected as well. Those construction come through lines of credit, which mean with India, so which means that it has facilities, etc., with respect to the import of products from India. I'll leave it here. We have seen a lot of those shifts, etc., and I think a lot of it is still moving. And as Ruka said, we will likely have next steps going on. But I'll leave it back to you, Chair, and we can go into other details as we get questions.
Thank you very much, Manisha. And I think what I like is that, you know, this is a report based on current and ongoing research. So, you know, we're getting empirical data on some of these, you know, shifting dynamics. And of course, we're talking about a moving target. By the time the report is published, you're already having new developments. And I mean, as you are speaking, I just thought to myself, I mean, I was thinking of some of the tools that have been adopted. You know, you've got interest-free loans, you've got grants, you've got low interest loans, you've got export and buyers credits, you've got infrastructure development that's taking place, you've got people-to-people relations and building on cultural ties. and the respective diasporas. And you've also got these trade agreements, which you went into. I'd also, before asking Arina to come in with her response, just point out that there's been also in the Q&A quite a number of questions and also live answers to that, and I would invite our colleagues to have a look at that. Now, some of the questions have related, for instance, to the extent to which the research has looked at connections between the Chinese local community in Mauritius and some of the inroads that China has been able to make in the country. Some of those questions have also looked at, who owns, for instance, those naval bases in Mauritius, in Mauritian waters between China and India. And the authors have obviously been also engaging in some of that discussion. There's also a new question which looks at what would be the opportunities in agriculture, both import and export, for Mauritius amongst the new dynamics and the new players. So, there's been quite a lively engagement in the Q&A there, and I think I appreciate that. There's also, of course, a question that's just come in on whether, can this be seen as a BRICS expansion, right? So keep those in mind. And before you engage some of those questions, I know you've answered some of them through the chat, but let me ask my colleague Arina Mauritian to just come with a few responses to the report and also to the discussion thus far. Arina, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Philani, and thank you so much, Ruqayyah and Manisha. So in reading the report, I mean, I absolutely enjoyed to see how a small island developing state actually is a powerhouse or a potential powerhouse for a region. And, an analysis of power and where it's located in terms of activity and location. And yes, sometimes people think Mauritius is actually the unlikeliest of places where this kind of sources of power to actually converge. And again, when looking at the map, you see the overlap of the oil transport, the maritime shipping, submarine cables, and a peppering of, your military bases, your posts, and just having a foreign presence. And yes, Mauritius sits at that midpoint in a vast sea area. But what struck me as well is how you describe Mauritius as a gateway to Africa. And that would be my question to you. In terms of what does it mean to be a gateway to Africa in 2023? And is this focus on logistic hubs? And what trend do you see, with two potential scenarios? Number one, you see the response, to demand of Mauritius as a geostrategic logistics point, and you see these kind of degrees of incremental adjustment to the national development planning, or do you see a response whereby national development planning drives consumption of services and infrastructure in the future? Another thing I really loved reading about was sharp power, the decline of democracy and expansion of authoritarianism, and how toxic it could look and how it could be insidious in achieving strategic aims. And what's really strange is how long it took us to start talking about sharp power. And indeed, you see this kind of example throughout all kinds of relations, not just what the examples we're looking at in the case today. And what always strikes is, how much over time, the relationships are often linked or explained away through heritage links or historical cultural narratives. And while they're important and should be appreciated, there is a concern that meta-narratives are often used to explain away behavior or perhaps downplay strategic intent. Coming to trade specifically, I mean, there's always that question, do FTAs work? And when we consider the broader case of African countries, when it's about opening up a market to specifically non-African countries, be it to emerging markets, developed countries as well. Even with the delayed tariff reductions and excluded items, the time for a domestic situation to adjust and thrive is that on the side of an African country when other conditions like your non-trade barriers need to have a complementary but rather accelerated growth path as well. And in this, you actually kind of start to see that African countries need to bust myths about the continental free trade area quite a bit. To what extent are countries now able to access African markets, and how has that changed, with the rules of origin coming in, according to which percentage needs to be declared, how much is manufactured where. And I think this is a rewarding development to African trade and how African agency is carried through, because this does mean more enhanced institutions. Another element was the impact through PPPs, construction of mass infrastructure, even social infrastructure. And, with reference to the airport terminal, bridges, low-cost housing, sewerage, other infrastructures with specific reference to a Chinese partnership, this would have been a prime example of a win-win cooperation, maybe 20, 30 years ago, when structural conditions allowed workers to live off lower salaries and living conditions, and return on investment was actually higher than for both parties. And I often ask a question when hearing about China's growth trajectory, governance, opening up and reform and how it's been able to engage other partners. And I ask, how would you do it today, experiencing the world as it is in 2020? Because it's unrealistic to share these kinds of lessons from a particular context that happened so many years ago, but cannot be replicated. So, in comparison to China's investments, I feel that they need to be more strategic because the resources are actually fewer in this kind of case. But perhaps are these partnerships may be striving to be more holistic in their approach in terms of SAGAR, which is creating an economic and security cooperation dynamic. Another point of interest I really wanted to ask was in terms of the MIFC, what kind of projects are going to be developed further? Because this, pardon me, was a partnership with Mauritius and the Indian government to start facilitating more partnerships and projects into that African continent. So when you look at, the free trade area, the specific one developed with China, and before this came about, Mauritius was considered India's geostrategic partner. And my impression of Chinese business is that it won't overlook markets because they're smaller. And perhaps the strategy has allowed them to reach the heights they have. But while Mauritius's, population of approximately 1.3 million is comparatively smaller than other markets, they've made a very compelling geostrategic argument, to be engaged, not just for location, but also the use of renminbi, as the clearance and settlement facility in Mauritius. Perhaps this is one of the more significant gains of the BRI, because China's ability to galvanize this dual circulation strategy and to internationalize the renminbi. But what does this, but it also really just brings the world back into China. I think that's a very innovative way of using your BRI as well. And then just coming to knowledge production and network building, I feel this actually has the most potential, especially because of the diffusion of values through education. And when you look at how trade and investment can be bridged with this, particularly with looking at the Huawei infrastructure development, the use, the training, the education, this is actually quite paramount to how telecommunications is used incredibly strategically to pivot off both of these poles. And then coming to media communication, I think what's always going to strike me is how and what is communicated, but more importantly, what is received. And in your research, have you been able to engage the local population to gauge, well, yes, the report did say that there is a somewhat positive or a positive perception of these countries, where are the critical points coming into? Where is the critical thinking coming in terms of what people want more out of these relationships? And again, one of my closing points, as Pelani mentioned, Mauritius's approach, friend to all, enemy to none. But where does this reach a limit when national interests begin to be affected? But again, this is really much of the discussion around the Indo-Pacific in general, because security issues heighten as well. The security and economic issues really just heighten the economics of survival. But thank you so much for the opportunity to engage, and I really enjoyed reading the paper.
Thank you so much. I'll
Thanks,
probably start, maybe if you want me to, and then maybe Manisha can sort of, there's a lot of questions that you've asked, Serena. Obviously, we'll try and make justice to most of them, but I'm not sure how. I'll be looking at your question around the gateway. I think, Mauritius has always been an important gateway, and it goes back to, early times when, the island was a stopover or landing dock for ships that would move from the Cape of Good Hope on to India and onwards, and it was also linked in terms of its plantocracy economy. So it was always a sort of a landing dock, a meeting point, a connecting sort of spot. Its location in the Indian Ocean also means that it is, it connects Asia with Africa, and also this narrative of, the Mauritian hub and the inwards and outwards sort of mobility of people, because there has always been people who have come to Mauritius. The very fact that there have never been any natives in Mauritius, but it's always been people from the Indian subcontinent, from Africa, from China, and the settlers, the white settlers as well. So it has always been an island of confluence and of mobility and of influx. So I think that has been built over time. It has obviously had a very important sort of economic argument of seeing Mauritius has the bridge or the stepping stone into Africa, in terms of, come to Mauritius and you will do business with Africa. And I think its credential, its democratic credentials, has a politically stable island, has a democracy, has the rule of law, has the institutions that would allow, for business operation and for to set up. So that was a very strong argument that was developed, and and it was also seen as, if you want to invest into Africa, comes from Mauritius. Although increasingly there is a lot of questions whether you have to come through Mauritius or you directly go in from into Africa itself. But I think that narrative has really been at the very center of marketing Mauritius as a hub, and to a certain extent it has worked well, but to a certain extent, why come from Mauritius when you can directly go? But I think some of the points that Manisha mentioned around the renminbi clearinghouse makes sense in terms of, come to Mauritius, because that would allow you to also benefit from certain sort of, advantages. And a lot of Chinese who live on the continent come to Mauritius to have a secondary house, or they have the kids live are educated in Mauritius because of the environment and the setup. So I think there are some interesting of seeing Mauritius as a sort of a gateway or stepping stone or hub, and I think it goes back to its original time. Now the soft power short power interplay, for us it was extremely interesting to how the switch happens in terms of what conversations will happen, who tells the story, how is the story told, what are the qualifiers that are used, how do you avoid slipping into a pro-China or anti-China, a lot of we were told, do not engage in, it's not about Chinese bashing, it's not about India bashing, it's not about Western bashing, but at the end of the day, how do you actually get to the very epicenter of the conversation? And that brings into the very whole argument, when people think about China, I mean, the average citizen doesn't think a lot. When they think about it, they see bridges, they see, roads that have been built. And it's a very much an argument that we've seen across Africa that, key infrastructures that, didn't exist suddenly come up. And I know in many African countries, people sort of laud that and say, well, yeah, at least we have a bridge, at least we have roads connected, and these are critical infrastructure. In Mauritius, I think, what is interesting is that for example, we talk to the media and media professionals, and there has not been this sufficiently that had a critical understanding of the intentionality and the why of such presence. Certain journalists mentioned that they started to sort of question certain infrastructure. There's the work around safe city, for example. China, through Huawei, has actually set up the Mauritius Safe City project. And when you started asking those questions, which sometimes people said they were inconvenient truth, and you suddenly said, don't engage in that because it's Chinese bashing. And the same when you would try to look at the stories around Agaliga, and that has been recent now. Again, be careful, do not engage into India bashing. So there's a lot of barriers that have been created because of the sensitivity of the place, that and the need to sort of balance it off. But if you're unable to ask those critical questions and fundamental questions around the very issue around who is it a win-win situation for? Is it really a win-win situation for Mauritius? And is it really benefiting Mauritius in terms of, and how do we play it out? I think one of the elements that we want to sort of tease out is, has Mauritius been able to build a strategy around those two powers in terms of how does it sort of say, listen, I'm going to get the better of both, and I'm going to sort of ensure the interest of the country is the one that sort of is primordial. And now the other element that you asked, and I think also Philani asked, was that, is Mauritius losing its capacity to be, enemy to none and friends to all? And that has always been a very strong part of what we call the non-aligned approach to Mauritius, because of its smallness, because of its capacity to actually play that card very strategically. In the more recent times, a number of observers have actually been posing the question whether Mauritius is losing this non-aligned status and is starting to become more aligned in terms of its posturing or positioning towards certain countries, and more specifically towards India, in the case of, the presence of India on Agaliga, the island. So I think, we need to be very astute in terms of how we sort of maneuver, how we understand strategically our position, our ability to sort of set the tone to the conversation, albeit we are small. But we also have to understand whether the other Western Indian Ocean islands, because Mauritius is not the only one. You've got the Seychelles, you've got Madagascar, you've got Comore, and so on and so forth. You've got Renewal. Is there a common understanding, a common strategy among those islands, for example, to sort of come together and, and ensure that the agenda of the islands are actually sort of assured? So I think there are many concerns, many issues. There's a need for public and very sort of open and critical debate about what are those powerhouses doing. And unfortunately, in Mauritius, we've seen that the moment that you sort of start to ask that question, those sensitive issues say, oh, don't touch that because this is India bashing, or don't say that you're entering into China bashing. So if you're unable to ask those critical questions, how are you able to ensure that those power players are actually ensuring a win-win for a small island? Because in the years to come, it will even get
issues, in particular in what we call the southwestern Indian Ocean region. which is one of the areas where we think is a little bit challenging. And in particular, I think a lot of the concern about piracy came about when there were the issues of the Shabab or their branch in Mozambique that took over cities in the northern of Mozambique. And if for those who know the region, you understand that North Mozambique is very close to northern Madagascar, and northern Madagascar is also very close to Mauritius. In fact, if you just look at the amount of illegal trade in terms of heroin, etc., that is caught in that circuit between Mauritius, Madagascar, you hear so many stories. That security issue is certainly, I think, at the back of the minds of lots of people. However, today, as we stand, there is very few possibility to understand the extent, because Mauritius doesn't have the infrastructure to be able to cover the whole of its territory in terms of understanding which boat is there, which ship is there, which ship has closed its transponder, etc. We are not sure, but there is a growing amount of evidence and thought that this is becoming a big piracy issue, and therefore this issue of securing the trade lines, the traffic, is important. The question from Liu, this is something that a lot of people who have been part of both of those negotiations, meaning the SECPA negotiation and the FTA negotiation with China, feel is the case. Meaning, if the agreement with China had not been signed, the agreement with India would still be pending today, because it took such a long time to come into being. Maybe it would still have been taking a longer time. Now, we don't know, you know, like in terms of the what if, etc. In terms of your this whole issue about Mauritius being the gateway, I think we look at gateway, or very often when we're thinking of gateway, we're really thinking of it as actual gateway where things, products, goods are passing through and going. It's very costly for goods to stop in Mauritius. We don't have the huge capacity that many, like the port of Salalah has, or ports in Dubai have, to be able, and we don't even have the efficiency to be able to manage this amount of goods. I think Mauritius tried to do that by setting up a free port, but it didn't work out that much. It does work in a certain way for certain countries such as Madagascar, but it doesn't work for the whole of the Eastern Africa region. However, where Mauritius has got a leverage is on the services sector, and in particular, I mean the financial services sector. And there, as you rightly pointed out, this renminbi clearinghouse is, I would say, perhaps part of the larger strategy of China to bypass the US dollar and be able to sell and buy directly in yuan rather than using the US dollar. As you know, in terms of reserve currency, the IMF and World Bank use the renminbi yuan as one of the reserve currency, but this is kind of a new occurrence. There are a few countries within Africa which have been using direct sales of products in renminbi. We have the petrol yuan, for instance, for Angola. But these, we see more and more cases. And I think one element, in particular when we're looking at the MIFC, and we'll have to see how that plays out, how that is developed. The fact that there's the clearinghouse, the fact that Mauritius has got a good financial services base, is perhaps not the best, but it is good. And in particular, when you're comparing with other locations in the continent, it's quite good in terms of the services it is providing. It's likely also going to be a gateway of Chinese investment or trade-related funds going in and out of China and Africa. So Mauritius kind of positioned itself as that financial gateway, as countries such as England is for the UK and London in some way, has positioned itself also as that type of gateway, even for Chinese investment and Chinese related trade that is happening. So we could eventually look at that as being a perspective of how things go. However, there are newer sectors that are being developed, and I feel perhaps there, both China and India have got a role to play. And that's, for instance, in the biopharmaceutical sector, which is one of the newer sectors that Mauritius wants to develop. And as we know, both China being one of the biggest producer in terms of what they call small molecules, and India being having so many research centers, so many specific production capacity as well. It could also be linkages that can happen along those ends. In terms of the question about whether an FTA works or not, for Mauritius, it has worked. Mauritius has always known how to, well, not always known, but built up the capacity to know how to take advantage of an FTA while the FTA lasted. And for instance, when we had AGOA, Mauritius was one of the biggest exporter of AGOA. Now the advantages have dwindled down and the costs have gone up quite a lot in Mauritius, but we knew how to take advantage of that. When there was the multi-tribe agreement, Mauritius was one of the big exporter of textiles to the European Union. Same thing for the sugar agreement. Mauritius was one of the big beneficiaries of that. I would not see, unless we do not get our act together, I do not see how our private sector, because a lot of that is not about government policy. A lot of that is private sector driven. How our private sector would not be able to take advantage of those opportunities. And they are trying. I think COVID, if we didn't have the COVID factor today, perhaps they would have already been able to explore a lot more in the sector. There was a question about agribusiness, and I think that's important. Mauritius, as you know, is a big exporter of sugar. So I think sugar would likely be the first product that could be in terms of the agribusiness. However, for Mauritius, securing sources, supply of agricultural product is very important. As we've seen, whether it is wheat, whether it is rice, whether it is pulses, etc., it is one of the big things that Mauritius imports from both of those countries, China and India. And therefore, it's when we're talking about agriculture, it's more for us in Mauritius a question of food security than a question of agriculture as well. So I'll leave it here, and maybe Chair, please.
Thank you. Colleagues, I think as we move into our last 5 minutes, I will ask a colleague of mine who's also participated, in these ongoing discussions, on the report, but also on broader discussions on the Indo-Pacific concept and implications for the African continent. I would ask Sanusha to come in with a question, comment, and then I would give both of the co-authors an opportunity to engage it, but also to give us maybe final remarks around how you see this particular report and the research around it going forward, not only in our own, region as SADC, but also the bigger continent. So Sanusha, if you could take the floor, and then we give our panelists a final word.
Thank you very much, Philani, and let me also congratulate Manisha and Ruqayya for asking IGD and colleagues to be part of this. I was part of your initial closed session, and it was fascinating because I think your panelists there captured a lot of the geostrategic issues around the way India sees the Indian Ocean and the way China sees the Indian Ocean, but the underlying kind of bubbling under issues is questions of security, particularly around the way India has, or rather Mauritius is anchored to India in the security context, around SAGA, the Colombo Pact, the question of how other islands outside of the mainstream of where Mauritius is reacting to India, and the way India sees this as the backyard. And I think it was Milan who said it very nicely in the first one last year, was that it's an unrequited love relationship or relationship between Mauritius and India, is that a lot of the time Mauritius stands up for India in geopolitical, geo-governance issues, like supporting India's candidacy for a reformed UN Security Council, questions around constantly trying to kind of be in this relationship with India, but India kind of just says, yeah, okay, fine, we'll just kind of deal with you, and you're not special for us. So I think that was very fascinating for me. If you could just comment a little bit on that, and also what Iqbal said around the role of media, the way he perceives the point that Philani raised around what he sees as the strategic issues around the Indian Ocean, but particularly around the strategy that links up to the Indo-Pacific. So India being part of the Quad and how that plays itself out. What he sees as history being very important in terms of the timelines around 83, the fear of a coup, the questions around the 86 and Rajiv Gandhi with Sri Lanka. And he mentioned something else in that discussion, and that was the relationship with Seychelles, Maldives, etc., and what's going on in terms of that, and how is that being perceived again? Because India is very much, I'm going back to the kind of security architecture in the region, because it's very important for the stability of the trade and how these lines are these maritime security lines are being discussed. And I think the challenge is whether or not the bilateral relationship between India and Mauritius is really where India is much more of a dominant actor in terms of how it shapes that. But then it's not lost on other actors in the Indian Ocean, that what do they do to try and prevent this dominance of how India sees the Indian Ocean as its backyard? And that's something just to comment on in that. And the final point, Philani, I want to make is really this question around, and I think it's a more of a provocative question, is India's Africa strategy really dovetailing in the Indian Ocean? Because that's where the strategic dynamics are. And there was this whole thing around the snooping affair that was mentioned as well by and colleagues can contextualize that for us in their response about how I think it was in the British Parliament, they spoke about India being this actor that they rely on. And the similar thing with the US. So in other words, there's our de facto kind of stabilizer in the region against China. And I'm just wondering whether that's where India's Africa strategy stops, because going further into the African continent hinterland, this is where India's private sector runs the Africa strategy. Thanks.
Wow.
Excellent. Panelists, I think Sanusha has just opened a new panel discussion, but I will give you a final word.
If I can say that's also to invite them back for the next round of a webinar.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's important because in them answering that, I would also like to hear from them what next steps they see for this research going forward. So first, Rukaya, and then Manisha.
Thank you, Shanusha. I think really bringing back it to the conversation that we had in December, which was really fascinating and some very open, candid, and frank discussion. And I think the unrequited love between India and Mauritius was put forward in a very, with evidence linked to the financial sector. But I think, when you're talking about, this link between India and China around security, and you mentioned and we mentioned as well, Sagar, and the legitimacy behind why India sees security as such an important element, it's linked with Mauritius. We know, the history between Mauritius and India in terms of security, because I think since the beginning, Mauritius has actually only had Indian security advisors. That has been a very clear point, and and in terms of, and that begs the question of the link, the sort of the dynamics that happen, and why is there such a sort of umbilical relationship between those India and Mauritius around security. This whole issue of dominance and backyard, there's been a lot of discussion among Mauritian sort of authors about India obviously seeing the South Indian Ocean has its own backyard, and actually having a sort of a predisposition to sort of set the rules of engagement and sort of defining how things are going to be looked at. But also, you talked about, certain other Indian Ocean islands in terms of their relationship with India. And it is obviously a sort of a strenuous sort of exchange. But I think what is very important to come up with is to understand really, and that brings me back to my original question of intentionality, because, we are starting to discover and uncover some interesting patterns, some interesting trends. We are not always privy to negotiations. Many of those negotiations are done government to government. Many of them are done behind closed doors. This whole issue of public perception of how they see India and China, or India as big brother to Mauritius, as a supporter, as the one who's always going to sort of ensure that, you're going to wheel for Mauritius. But in the reality, it's not really the case, and this unrequited love. So I think this whole issue of unpacking and understanding, what are the linkages, what are the undercurrents, and I think that responds a little bit to Philani's question, what's the next stage? I think the next stage is, this one was an initial conversation. We started digging a little bit, we started looking at potential sort of areas that might provide additional scope for research, but also connected that Mauritius is not just an isolated dot in the Indian Ocean. It's part of a grid. It's part of a network in terms of of what's happening in the Indian Ocean. So I think asking more of those important questions, which allow us to sort of unpack this India-Mauritius, Mauritius-China relationship, and those new players will allow us to start, and as Manisha said, we had many more questions and a couple of answers. And the fact that we had that means that it's really an important moment to also maybe sort of link it up with with other institutes like yourself, the IGD, and try and see how the work we can do together in terms of complementing or looking at it from a different perspective, which is the island-based perspective. So I think, there's so many interesting questions, and, the geostrategic issue is not going to go away. It's going to become even more pertinent. And I think, as this region gets even more sort of charge. And for me, I'm very concerned about the submarine cable, because I showed that in the map. And those submarine cables are critical in terms of the type of architecture that we are having. Data today is going to be an extremely important sort of commodity. And the reference that we make to in the report, and Shanusha mentioned the sniffing episode of actually sort of seeing whether those cables and potentially, of the credibility and the reliability and the security of your data. And that really created a storm last year, but it has suddenly gone off the radar. And again, we wonder what has been negotiated behind closed doors. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for potential research. And I think this is just the beginning of a long journey.
Thank you very much. Let me ask Manisha to come in with her final word.
Thank you. I think Sanusha has opened the door to so much more now. It's more final words than one final word. I think from one element that Sanusha hinted to, Mauritius, or people in Mauritius, has always perceived both China and India with sentimental type of lens, meaning these are our ancestors' land, and therefore we love our ancestors, and we want to help them, they want to help us, and perhaps they're helping us a bit more because we're just kind of the grandchildren, we are the children of them who are here. And in fact, in China, for instance, the fact that the Chinese New Year is not just a holiday, but a national holiday, is considered to be like Mauritius respecting so much of the Chinese culture. There's a lot of that mutuality between the people, especially when we're looking in particular the people. But then that has kind of blurred a little bit the lens of interest. So there's the lens of sentimentality and the lens of interest. And I think for both China and India and many more entities, and that comes to what Philani was saying, what next? The lens of interest is getting more important in the sense that not just Mauritius, but the whole region is getting more important in what I would say an Indo-Pacific type of engagement. And I'll come to that because, for instance, I don't know if you followed, but you probably have, but Australia is buying nuclear submarines. Initially, it had agreements with France. It changed its agreement and is buying nuclear submarines from the US. The submarines, I'm sure, are not going to be just on display in the museums. They're likely going to be around the seas and likely going to be around the seas in the Indian Ocean. So that raises the stakes in terms of what's there for the future. And in that raising of the stakes, another player which we think is getting mobilized for a bit more is Japan as well. And that takes it in that larger Indo-Pacific, whether it is through loans, not just to Mauritius, but investment in Madagascar, for instance, resources. Everyone wants to secure resources, and Japan is also looking at those now. So that's taking this element in a broader light. The other perspective that I think, and we raised that in the report as well, in China, normally start a trade agreement with a small country to kind of test and try and see how it works, etc. Mauritius is a small country, so we don't know. Perhaps for Africa next, it's likely maybe an Africa-wide engagement with China, or many trade agreements between African countries and China. So those could be elements that can come in next. And having said that, all these open the door to much more research. But I think for us, that security aspect is an element that we don't have much, there's not enough data. There's only so much that we can find out, but that could be an area to dig further into. The whole larger perspective in terms of the AFCFTA, in terms of bilateral agreements between China and Africa, is very important. And you asked a question, Sanusha, about what is the India strategy. I think the India strategy for Africa doesn't exist. It probably has been more little bits and pieces. As you know, I work extensively on the continent, and you do not see India being such a big player in, whether it is in business, elsewhere. It's patchy in terms of its investment, etc. While for China, I think it is a very resource-focused strategy with Africa. Perhaps it will morph into some other things later, but that resource focus, you can see it, you can feel it, you can even see it with illegal mines or legal mines. You can see it when you're traveling, from Addis to Ghana, the number of, for instance, Chinese workers or Chinese people that are going there. You feel it and you see it, and it's very much focused on that. So I'll end on this note, and thank everyone for listening to us and for being there, and all these lovely questions. So over to Pilani, if he's still there or he's suffering from.
Thank you very much. And just lastly to say, and I hope you can hear me, colleagues. But I just wanted to congratulate you. I've switched off my video because we were talking about soft power, where South Africa is struggling with producing power. So I've switched it off just for a better connection. Now, the last thing I would like to say is, besides congratulating you, is that yes, this opens up, I think, more opportunities for an ongoing research, but also engagement with the continent, so that we do overcome what can be termed sea blindness. The last comment I want to read is really just from one of our guests, who's really thanking us for this webinar. And she says she's is actually based in Paris and studying international relations at a master's level. Having lived 8 years on Reunion Island, she's quite keen on documenting firsthand and through literature and studies on the geopolitical stakes of this zone of the Indian Ocean. So, I mean, she's just sort of appreciating what this webinar does in terms of the work that she does. And I would invite her to contact any of us at IGD, whether myself, Sanusha, or Arena. Our details are available on our website. We're always keen on working with students and with young people, especially on these topics. So I definitely invite you to do that. And with those closing remarks, thank you very much, colleagues. We look forward to an ongoing engagement on this topic. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone, for having us and engaging on this important conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, very much a pleasure. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Goodbye.
Bye.